Hi, everyone. Good evening. Hello to everyone online as well. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all today to the Upper House and to particularly welcome Alessandra to hear tonight's paper. Alessandra is a regular and very welcome presence at the BSA. She is a scholar of Byzantine art and archaeology and currently professor in Cochran University. She's worked for the last decade on huge numbers of different projects, but in particular, the Archaeopark project, which encourages community engagement and also interreligious dialogue as well. She has very, very wide interests, ranging from late antique housing in Constantinople to Byzantine fortifications of Edessa to conservation and public archaeology as well. And she has published extremely widely on many of these topics, including a recent interim report on her museum survey study project and related, and I think that's related to your topic, not this one, but a paper on the work of Stephen Runciman and others, which you've published in 2024 as well, and suspect it's related to the topic that we're going to hear about tonight. As I said, Alessandra is a very, very welcome presence, and the dog, Chewy, is a particular fan of Alessandra, and he's learned a great deal of Italian thanks to Alessandra as well. And we are all hugely grateful for you being here tonight and offering us this paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's so nice to be here on the first hot day of the season, I guess. So before I begin, I want to thank the BSA because this is my hiding place, and the birds in Kolonaki sing in a different way. And it's wonderful to spend time here to work in the library. My words of thanks are also to all the polyphonic voices in Turkey, which are currently opening new research path on the historiography of Byzantine studies in Turkey. So I happen to be just one of them. And as a foreign Byzantinist based in Turkey, I work on foreign Byzantinists that have preceded me in Turkey. But my words of thanks are also to colleagues who are broadening this research and to students, particularly at this time, for their determination, curiosity, and strength in their ideals. So let me begin with my first disclaimer. That is that this presentation intends to explore a somewhat lesser known aspect of Sir Stephen Runciman's historical and academic biography. That is his time in at Istanbul University, and for the relevance his presence had towards the establishment of Byzantine studies in Turkey. I do not have the first-hand memories of Sir Stephen Runciman as a supreme storyteller, whether at the dinner table or at academic gatherings, many of which took place here in Greece and here at the BSA, nor can I compete with the many who have assessed his majestic sweep of historical and known writings. So let us set the stage, and let us set the stage in Istanbul. The Bard of Byzantium, as defined and painted by Anthony Breyer, about whom a little bit later on in his 2002 memory. I quote, "Stephen Runciman first saw the skyline of Istanbul marching out of the midst from the gas works at Yedikule to the minarets of Hagia Sophia, from the deck of his grandfather's three-masted schooner, the Sunbeam, itself an historic yacht, in April 1924. For a 20-year-old Cambridge undergraduate, it was the only way to arrive. He never forgot the scene. True, he missed meeting the last caliph, for they had inconsiderately deposed the Sultan's heir a few weeks before, but complained rarely, and camels still swayed over the Galata Bridge. There were rather fashionable veils on the Grand Rue de Perra, and families such as the Guitals flourished all over the place. Outside the then unencumbered Theodosian land walls, a gypsy told him that he would have had illness that would survive to a ripe age. The fortune teller was right. Now that we have set the stage, we move to Sir Runciman's second visits to Istanbul, and we begin with information partly derived from the Traveler's Alphabet, Partial Memories, published in 1991, a copy of which, of course, is here at the BSA. And you can see here on the screen the Turkish translation of the same volume. Further, the death of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, which took place in Istanbul on the Bosphorus seashore Ottoman palace of Dolmabahce on November 10th, 1938, his successor to the presidency was Mustafa İzmet İnönü, also known as İzmet Pasha. İnönü kept his post until May 22nd, 1950, becoming one of the longest surviving presidents of the Turkish Republic. The 20-year-old Cambridge had been to the Dolmabahce Palace at the invitation of Mustafa Kemal. So the episode that follows took place most likely between the end of 1941 and the beginnings of the following year, at the time in which Istanbul had not functioned in its capacity of the Ottomans' empire capital for just less than 2 decades. It was probably therefore between 1941 or early 1952 when İzmet İnönü, whom you see here, next to Mustafa Kemal, was being driven around Istanbul and noticed a building he did not recognize. Inquiries were made, and finally someone from his entourage answered it was probably a Byzantine period building. Further questions by the second president of the Turkish Republic led to no additional details about the building. İnönü's officials could not tell him anything more. The president was irritated by the fact that his entourage knew nothing or near to nothing about Byzantium. Byzantium was, in his words, all part of the history of the city and of the country, end of quote, according to him. At this point, the Minister of National Education, Hasan Ali Yücel, who served between 1938 and 1946, was summoned for further inquiries, confirming that indeed Byzantine topics were not taught at the university level. Yücel was asked to immediately remedy the situation. I don't know how familiar you are with the image that is shown here on the screen, and with the project of the Kioy Institut that swept across the Anatolian countryside at this point in time in order to establish schools for all children, including girls, in the new Turkish language. So Yücel was asked to immediately remedy the situation, and we now go to Ankara, more or less at the time in which all of this was happening. He decided to get in touch with Michael Grant, a well-groomed Briton, Cambridge read in classics, who had served during World War II for a year as an intelligence specialist in London. Grant had just arrived in, at this time, neutral Turkey to serve as the first British Council representative in Ankara. Hasan Ali Yücel appealed to Grant, who recommended the not yet in his 40s James Cochran Stevenson Runciman as the potential recipient of an academic position at Istanbul University to teach Byzantine subjects. Runciman and Grant had met at Trinity College and shared common interests. In fact, already in 1937, they had explored together Trebizond and its region, venturing into the Tzigana Pass. I wonder how many of the Byzantinists in this room have been there. And on the Pontic Mountains, thus contributing to the advance of their own research, as well as of notable interests in the region that would have followed in British academic circles. One of the other reasons Grant could strongly recommend Runciman to Yücel was for his impeccable academic pedigree. In fact, Runciman had studied at Trinity with the historian John Bagnall Bury, who had interested him in Byzantine history. Also, while at Oxford, Runciman met with David Talbot Rice, 1903-1972, who at the end of the 1920s would have preceded Runciman in Istanbul to work at the Mire Lion, Bodrum Jami excavations, and later, after Runciman's departure from Istanbul, would have excavated portions of the Great Palace. At Oxford, Runciman had also met with Robert Byron, who introduced him to orthodoxy, which would have proven a significant meeting in Runciman's personal biography. So, Grant's recommendation was followed upon right away, and Runciman had moved a few months earlier to Jerusalem, where, according to him, was surrounded by friends of different religious communities. In Jerusalem was also the young Anthony Breyer, whose family had been dispatched and where he spent most of his childhood. The two met through family connections in the city and later would have worked together to promote Byzantine studies academically and in the field through the British Academy. Anthony Breyer, whose DPhil thesis was on the Trapezuine Empire, created the 1976 Center for Byzantine, Ottoman, and Modern Greek Studies at the University of Birmingham and became its long-serving first director. This is where, for the first time, Turkish and Greek students, among others, would have studied disciplines under the same roof. And for those of you who have personal memories of Breyer's office, we cannot continue this lecture without recalling the Trabzonspor football team flag hanging in his room. And I strongly recommend going through Breyeriana if you want to explore also something about the relationship between Runciman and Breyer. So we go back to Jerusalem, where Runciman was reached by a Foreign Office communication informing him of the developments from Ankara. A few days later, on February 24, 1942, Runciman left Jerusalem on a land journey by train and other means with a stop in Ankara, from where he headed towards his new destination in Istanbul, where he arrived on March 1st of the same year. This journey would not be possible today. On The same day of his arrival, Runciman signed his contract at Istanbul University, becoming the first professor of Byzantine history, archaeology, and art history in the history of the Turkish Republic. Some weeks ago, a dear Greek friends recounted how some parts of the story I've tried to outline were told with much more colorful tones by Sir Runciman at dinner time at their home. So, in a certain sense, some of the facts are known, let us say, through oral history and what contained in the travel alphabet. By the way, this is the portal of Istanbul University. At the same time, until archival work conducted by dear colleagues and friends Zeynep Kuban and Verda Bingöl, the accepted and official narrative, what we would call the textbook assumption, was that the first chair in art history, in the history, apologies for the repetition, of the Turkish Republic was that of Turkish and Islamic art, assigned in 1943 to the German-speaking scholar Ernst Dietz at Istanbul University. So, and I don't know how familiar you are with Dietz. We could spend another 20 minutes of this presentation talking about him and the work he published. You see, there's his signed copy of Türk Sanatı that was published in 1946. It was one of the predicaments of all foreign academics teaching in Turkey to produce a manual on the art history of the period they were teaching, something that Runciman never completed. But Dietz apparently did, and his Turkish art in 1946, in which he suggested the presence of Armenian influences in the formation of Turkish art, resulted in popular protests, newspapers, propaganda. His contract was interrupted, and in 1948 he returned to Vienna. What also may concern us for later on, for a discussion we may have at the end of this presentation, is the relationship with Josip Strigovsky and his theories on Orient oder Rome and the origins of Christian art that were incorporated in some of the Turkish nationalistic ideologies of this period. So, and here I'm showing you the building in which, Runciman walked in after that very long journey on March 1st, 1942, which actually took fire, caught on fire and was completely destroyed when he was there. So he actually had a lot of difficulties also in terms of being able to teach, and sometimes he was running some of his classes from his home. He moved around a lot. He lived at the Pera Palace Hotel for a certain amount of time, etc. So at the same time, I told you about the fact that Dietz is officially recognized as the first chair of art history in the history of the Turkish Republic. So it seems that the history of the institutionalization of Byzantine studies in Turkey rests on two different data sets. The first one is represented by the very recent publication of documents preserved in the Turkish State Archives, or Türkiye Cumhuriyeti Başbakanlık Arşivleri, by Kuban and Bingöl, which confirm the chronologies described by Runciman in his biographical and oral history accounts, and basically provides official evidence to dispute the assumption that the first chair in art history was that of Turkish and Islamic art. it is also worth reflecting on how historiography has until now overlooked the combination of historical circumstances and documentary evidence. Moreover, of how this documentary evidence was not known until very recently. So the CONAC is replaced by this project by Sedat Aki Eldem and Emin Halid Onat. This is the Faculty of Letters in a photograph by the famous Turkish Armenian photographer Ara Güller. Runciman never had the opportunity of actually physically lecturing in this building. So the second data sets relies on the historiographical and biographical narratives by Runciman and the events described above, which show the mechanisms of a top-down governmental decision accompanied by a swift implementation of the same. Runciman himself writes, quote, "In 1942, when I was living in Jerusalem working for the government information services, I suddenly received word from our foreign office that I was to go to Istanbul," end of quote. Also, the story speaks about politics and of reciprocal cultural diplomacy at the time of complicated geopolitical relations between Turkey and the United Kingdom. There is also a story of personal academic relationships in the United Kingdom with research interests in Istanbul, the Black Sea and Anatolia, which would have ultimately led to the development of Byzantine studies in Turkey and in several universities in the United Kingdom and Scotland, thanks to a beneficial mechanism of reciprocal exchanges. So in a certain sense, what I'm also trying to say that these trips that Runciman was taking and had been taken before, his relationship with Breyer, etc., paved the way for British academia to open a window in this part of the world which had not been opened before, but also that had not been opened, for example, by German scholars and by others. So, and this, I think, is what prompted a lot of very direct relationships of exchange that start probably at this point in time. So, by the way, this is the big conference hall of the Faculty of Letters of Istanbul University, at Istanbul University. Within, and this is, for those of you who are familiar with Istanbul, it's no longer how you see it in this picture. This is the famous Şimşek Sane, built in 1707, remains of the Ottoman Han and of the late antique tetrapylon in the Forum Theodosi. The new building of Istanbul University was across the street and a little bit further down. So this helps you also imagining the landscape, the urban landscape in which Runciman found himself at the time in which this city had been devastated by fires, population exchange, allied forces occupation, and had been deprived of his role as the capital of two empires just two decades earlier. Within a day from his arrival in the city, and on March 1st, 1942, Runciman, as I said, signed his contract and was asked to begin at once in mid-term of classes and spent the following 3.5 years as a professor in Turkey. So there was no time for jet lag. Runciman contractual obligations so these are the Başbakanlığı documents, included 1, teach courses in Byzantine art history. 2, organize research field trips for the students. 3, prepare a comprehensive bibliography on the Byzantine Empire. 4, when required by the Ministry of Education, provide consultantships on the Byzantine monuments of the city and country. 5, work as a consultant for the archaeological discoveries of the Byzantine period. The first clause in Runciman's contract is probably what kept him more occupied with. In fact, he was writing his lectures in English, which were translated sentence by sentence, as he points out, by the assistant appointed to him by the university. Students followed predominantly his history courses. All Turks, remarks Runciman in his memories, insomuch, quote, members of the minority races, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews, were discouraged by the authorities from studying history, end of quote. A smaller cohort that was following lectures in Byzantine art history included Christians and Jews. Although Runciman had a discrete command of spoken Turkish, he wrote his lectures in English, translated by the assistant that was appointed to him, and this was a graduate of Hittitology of the same university, fluent in English and other languages. I had to put this slide. So, and her name was Munire Çakarcarlı Çelebi. I can tell you that neither Koray Durak nor myself have been able to find a single photograph of Munire Hanım. So what you see on the screen is not her, but is Mukerrem Usam Anabolu, who worked exactly the same way in which the Munire Hanım worked for Runciman. And Mukerrem Usman Anabolu was the assistant of Professor Paolo Verzone, the third foreign Byzantinist to come to Istanbul a few years later on. And she eventually became a professor, as you can see, at the University of Istanbul. And there was a lot of press about her in Turkey because Professor Köpeyle derse giriyor. So the professor is going to her university classes accompanied by her dog. And this was something that really shook the interest of people at that point in time. So Munire Hanım worked with Runciman throughout his time at Istanbul University, developing a personal and shared social circles relationship. So she belonged to an upper Istanbuliot class. The relationship European academics established or did not with the local language in Turkey contributed to that feeling of not belonging, or what in more contemporary terms would be defined as linguistic integration. Many of the academics from Germany and Austria who had distanced themselves from the National Socialism by moving to Istanbul with Turkey representing a point of exile, struggled with Turkish. While they contributed to the progress of the young Turkish Republic, their linguistic barrier was overcome by very few of them. For all of them, academic contracts demanded that not only all classes taught had to be translated into Turkish, but also all examinations. This means that the role of the assistants, translators, was important and that the relationship between the mentor and the students was mediated by the assistants, thus creating likely distances and misunderstandings at times. These were overcome if the mentor spoke Turkish, as in Runciman's case, who enjoyed communicating with students in his conversational Turkish, or when the students knew other languages. As expected, the assistant translators might have been lost in translation for their own subjective interpretation of the written materials they received, their scarce interest in the subject taught, or poor academic understanding, training, or cultural background. And the additional element here is the question of terminology, because these assistant translators belong to the first generation of Turks who started using a new language, the shift from Osmanlıca. And there was no terminology established for a lot of the disciplines, including Byzantine studies. So it was very difficult to translate these lectures and the exams. So Munire Hanım was dismissed from her position of assistant after Runciman left and replaced in 1948 by a young Turkish student of Byzantium who had recently returned from Germany, Semavi Ece. Ece continues to be considered the first professor of Byzantine art in Turkey at Istanbul University. And here you have an image of Mustafa Semavi Ece. By 1945, Runciman had moved to Athens, where he became a representative of the British Council. In his own words, his experience in Turkey is summarized as follows, quote, "From a purely academic aspect, it was not very rewarding," end of quote. Now, to draw some preliminary conclusions of this work in progress, following are some considerations about the cultural dimensions of diplomatic relationships. When Runciman joined the faculty at Istanbul University, a vast cohort of his colleagues came from European countries. More specifically, the university had recruited displaced academics from Germany as well as from Vienna in the aftermath of the Anschluss. Their hiring was thrusted on parameters which excluded distinction on their ideological orientation. In a certain sense, Michael Grant's task at the British Council, and by his own admission, was to promote the hiring of Anglo-Saxon academics to Istanbul University to contrast the influx of Germany. And this is information I actually found here, the BSA. Among the classicists, Grant succeeded in bringing to Istanbul was Ronald Syme, 1903-1989, historian of the Roman Empire, who was entrusted with the chair of classical philology exactly in the same period in which Runciman was at the same university. Syme is remembered as an ardent Turcophile, fluent in the language, spent 2 years at Istanbul University between 1942 and 1945 to return to Trinity College at Cambridge. Syme was initially seen with diffidence among Turkish academic circles, as he had worked at the British Embassy in Ankara prior joining the faculty at Istanbul University. Similarly, Grant's academic reputation is overshadowed in Turkey by his perception as a political and diplomatic instigator more than an academic facilitator. This perception may have applied to Runciman, and I leave this for discussion. However, Runciman never took sides on the quarrels between Turks and Greeks and maintained warm relationships with all of them. As Abulafia, who knew him personally, concluded in his memory, quote, he retained an affection for things Turkish for the rest of his life, end of quote. Although his Istanbul years were defined by ups and downs of all sorts, Runciman would have become a vocal supporter of Byzantine studies in Britain. His passion for Greece is well known to all of you in this room, but also his interests for Turkey, I hope have become a little bit better known today. His legacy for the development of Byzantine studies in Turkey, training of students and of academic exchanges remains scarcely known. I hope this presentation will lead to more information and awareness about his legacy in Turkey. Thank you very much.